So I guess a good way of looking at it is if I go into my Blender add-ons directory, you'll find a folder called BlenderBIM.
Okay.
And oh, I should delete this. Basically, you should get these three folders here. There's a BIM folder, a libs folder, and then the init. And the BIM folder is where all of BlenderBIM's code is, whereas the libs folder is where all the dependencies are. If I go inside here, you'll see that it's pretty much empty. But of course, whenever I do a release, I will fill up this folder with a whole bunch of different dependencies. So you'll see it all there. But you won't find it on the repository because they are external dependencies. So all the code that you're mostly going to be concerned with is in the BIM folder. And there used to be a very simple structure to the code, but it can be a bit intimidating. And effectively, there were a few important files. There's an export file, which handles the export process. The import file, which handles the import process. Then there is an operator file. So in Blender, whenever you press a button like this button or this button or this button, or trigger a function in Blender which changes something or executes something, that's called a operator. So every single button, whenever I press if I edit a property set or add a new property set, that's calling an operator. So in the operator file, you will find every single possible function. Things like exporting IFC is a button, importing IFC is a button, selecting the global ID is a button, selecting an attribute is a button, selecting a property set. There's so many of these. And each function, as you can see, is very small. Like each one is only about 20, 30 lines of code, but there are a lot of them. So just because there are so many functions in BlenderBIM, but each one is very small and very simple. You can see this one is almost nothing. It's one line of code. It just opens a website. This is adding a quantity takeoff. You can see it's very tiny. Removing a quantity takeoff, also really tiny. And so on and so on. But even though each one is very simple, simply because there are so many things you can do, like removing, adding, editing, reassigning, opening, it makes this file very big. So you can see it's like 3,500 lines. And that can make it a bit intimidating, especially for a fresh developer coming into the project, because it looks very big. But don't worry about it. They're all each one, as you can see, is very small. Again, very small, very small, very small. Oh, sorry, very small. Then there are prop. So in Blender, whenever Blender wants to store data in the blend file and store things like this piece of information here, this is a float value. And this is stored inside the Blender file. This is stored inside the Blender file. And so each one of these is a Blender property. And even this is a Blender property, right? A dropdown. And all of that is defined in the property file. And so whenever I want to store information, so if I scroll down a bit, you'll get an idea. So documents. IFC documents, I can store a name, a human nation, purpose, blah, 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 blah. So this is just a huge list of properties which can be stored inside the Blender file. So once you do a import process, Blender will read the IFC file and store all of that IFC information inside these Blender properties. And then when you do an export process, Blender will read all these properties and put it back into an IFC. Does that sort of make sense?
Okay. Okay. So it's like the connector between the IFC and the Blender.
Correct. Correct. So Blender, the data stored in Blender is very, very similar to IFC, but this just lets you, I guess it's a way of storing it in Blender. So when you save your blend file, all this data will stay with it. Then the final importation file is the UI file, and that's the code which displays all these panels. You know, it says put a button here, put a drop down here, put some text here, stuff like that. So for example, if I go into the UI file, this is a panel that shows, I guess, something like this one, structural relationships. So it will say, okay, this is the draw function. So this says where the panel is. It's in the object tab, which is this tab here. So, and then there is the title of the panel, which is over here. And then it says, you know, just draw the panel. So draw this property, and this is a Boolean property. So therefore it shows as a checkbox. And then after that, if this, then it'll show a few more things, but I assume it's false right now. So then show another property, which is the member connection, which is this one here. So basically every single panel you'll find in this file. But this is the old way of doing it. The other files are a bit more less important. The helper is just a bunch of helper functions, which I think I'll be slowly deleting. So for example, before IFC OpenShell had the utility module, a lot of these functions were in helper, but now I can delete them, so I probably should. So basically, if I needed to use a function again and again and again, that didn't really belong anywhere, I put it in the helper class. But over time, I'm finding that they can be moved away into a better location. Don't worry about annotation. This is an experimental file to deal with annotation. Decoration draws decoration in the viewport. So for example, if I have a new drawing, for example, and I want to create a dimension, the code that draws this red thing with the dimension, the arrowheads, all that's decoration. Okay. So that's the code which does that. IFC is a very simple file, and all it does is it stores the currently loaded file in memory. So every time you import a file, Blender will store that file in memory, so you can access it from the console, for example. So this file, you can see, has a class called IFC store with a function called getFile. So if I import you can see that's my IFC OpenShell file object of the currently open file. Finally, I forgot what this is. What's scheduler? Oh, right. So this is part of the drawings and construction documentation generation. So BlenderBIM has a feature which generates schedules, things like door schedule, or window schedule, or whatever, stuff like that. And this is still experimental code. So this generates basically spreadsheet type stuff. Yep.
So for this one, is like using the LibreOffice software instead of making a schedule inside the project like Revit.
Correct. What you would do is you would get your IFC data however you want to get it. Maybe use IFC CSV or whatever you want to do. And you format it however you want to format it in OpenOffice. And this will convert that into a nicely styled table in SVG that you can put on a sheet that follows the conventions of the font and things like that. So LibreOffice creates an open document file, And then
Yeah.
this BlenderBIM will convert that into SVG, which you can then put in a drawing. So there's actually a feature for that somewhere, which ODS schedule. So you just add a new schedule, you link it to a file, and maybe this will work. So let's see if let's create a new schedule. ABC. So if I saved this as a test, then I think I put it in my documents. Test, build schedule, and you can see this is a schedule that you would put on a sheet, for example. So if I create an A3 sheet, I can say add a sheet, and I'll add that schedule to a sheet. And if I create that sheet, for example, that's schedule 1 on the sheet. Yeah, so it's still very crap, but but yeah, the code is there.
Actually, it's good enough. For now. Yeah.
For a simple project. What else is there? Oh, this is the code which manages sheets, right? It needs to create sheets and find out sheet numbers and revisions and stuff like that. That's in here. This writes SVGs. It's pretty simple. But this is the old system where everything was just kind of dumped. The new system is a lot more organized. So to give you an idea, in the old system, when you press import, it will read the entire IFC file, and it would store all of those properties into all of these Blender properties. And if I open up this properties file, you can see that the properties file is like 1,400 lines long, which means that it's storing a lot of properties. Very annoying. You have to keep track of them all, and you have to make sure they're organized and export correctly. And then when you do export, Blender has to process all those 1,000 properties, and it has to process your entire scene with all your objects, which it could be like 100,000 objects, and then export it. So it's a very slow, inefficient process, and it assumes the user is always organizing their Blender in a way that's valid. So if you don't do that, then you are waiting for your export, and then it doesn't work, and then you only find out later, and it's very, very annoying. Import is slow because it has to import 1,000 properties. And the export is slow because it has to process everything. So the refactor I'm doing right now is rebuilding everything in BlenderBIM from scratch, but with a new technique that instead of loading all those properties, it doesn't load any properties at all. And the properties are actually loaded at runtime when you click on objects. And also for export. So for export, it doesn't process your scene. Instead, every time you're changing things in Blender, like if I draw a new wall, that's when it writes to IFC. It writes to IFC as you're drawing the wall or editing the object. So, I want to change
like a
this.
Delta export.
Not even a delta, because if I am editing this, so let's say I edit the attribute of this wall. So I change the name to ASDF, and I press save. The moment I press save, the IFC is already edited.
Oh, so real-time Delta exporting or something.
Correct. So if I choose to export, all it's doing is writing a file. It doesn't do any processing at all. It just does a file write. So that makes it very fast. And because it behaves like a Delta, it also tracks the full owner history. I can have multiple, and because it's directly to IFC, there's no Blender anymore. There's no Blender properties being edited. It's directly IFC properties being edited. Theoretically, I can have many users on different apps all editing the same IFC file at the same time and have this sort of collaboration or multi-user behavior. It's complicated sometimes, but I think overall it's a much better approach. So the way I've designed it, so what will happen is that this export IFC file will disappear. It's just going to, because there's nothing. It turns into 5 lines of code or something like that. And this import IFC file, which, so just to give you an idea, right now this export IFC, it's like 3,500 lines of code. That will get reduced to something like 10 lines of code or something like that, maybe 20. So this will disappear. The import IFC, which is also huge, you can see it's like 2,000 lines. And that's after I've already started deleting stuff. It will cut drastically. Maybe it will go and be only 500 lines or something like that. It will be very, very small because it doesn't need to deal with properties. And also this property file will shrink a huge amount. Maybe it will only be, maybe there are only 200 properties instead of 1,000 properties. And so on and so on. There'll be a lot more efficiencies. Also, the code will be a bit different because right now the import and export has to process everything. When I import, it has to process the entire ISD file. When I export, it has to process my entire Blender scene. But now, because I'm treating the IFC file directly, I only need to process what I want to edit. So let's say I only want to edit attributes. I actually don't need to process aggregates. I don't need to process class. I don't need to process object material. I don't need to process anything except for attributes. So that makes the system a lot more flexible, because if there's a bug in object materials, for example, it doesn't affect attribute editing. So the system becomes a lot more stable over time. And also there's no data loss. So for example, right now in BlenderBIM, I haven't built like a feature for MEP systems, right? So if I import into BlenderBIM and I export, then I lose all that data about MEP systems because I haven't built it yet. But in this new feature, with this new system, all that data stays because
you're not touching it.
I'm not touching it, correct. So all the parametric geometry also stays. I don't lose any parametric geometry. There's zero data loss in this new approach.
I see. So this is the refactoring that you're doing.
Correct. So all the new refactored code is in this. By the way, I should describe what are in these 2 folders. The schema holds basically information about the IFC schema in JSON format. So, for example, stuff like this. But all of these files will be deleted. I don't need them anymore because now I can just use IFC OpenShell to query the schema. Almost everything in this file will disappear. I think the only thing which will stay are classifications, because I want to ship out of the box some classifications. Data is an old. So whenever I generate drawings or sheets or stuff like that, or custom property sets, it's like a project-specific output. It gets dumped in this data file. But I think in the new system, this data file will just disappear as well. So all this will get deleted.
But where are they gonna go? Like, how are you going to handle the data's problem?
I think I can just use temporary files. Actually, no, sorry, you're right. Some of the, you're right. Actually, this will mostly stay. I think half will go. So for example, this handles materials, but that's no longer required. Fonts will stay. That's for generating drawings, so that has to stay. Schedules, once I generate schedules, they get put in here. I'm not sure. I'll have to think about it. Yeah, you're right. Maybe this will mostly stay. I think some of these will get deleted. So this window typical was how I used to manage properties, like door styles or window styles. But that's a very old way, an old way that I handled things in BlenderBIM. I think I'll just delete it. Anyway, all the new code is in here, this module code file. And each one of these modules represents a concept or a portion of IFC that it can edit. So for example, aggregates edits IFC aggregates. Attributes edits IFC attributes. And nothing else. It doesn't know anything about spatial structures. It doesn't know anything about anything. The only thing it cares about is attributes. And BCF is just BCF. BIM tester handles BIM tester. Kobe handles Kobe. Context handles geometric context.
Okay.
So each one of these modules doesn't care about any of the other ones. So I can load and unload only what I want to edit or whatever I'm developing at the time. So for example, this attribute module, which I'm playing with right now, that creates this panel here now.
So the UI file will help the Blender to draw this area, to draw the attribute area, and the buttons and all the data will represent in here, or
even the UI is here now.
Okay.
So everything you need to modify attributes, things like UI and operator, and any data you need to grab. So for example, I need to read this data at runtime, right? So this is the file which does it. It reads it. So if it lets me load a particular IFC product, and it will loop through all of the attributes, and it will load it in.
Oh, okay. Pack the module into one folder, and
Correct.
The Blender will get it. Okay.
So it's much smaller as well. Like you can see, all these files are very tiny, and you'll notice also that these two files deal with Blender, but these two don't. I mean, this one, obviously you need some Blender UI code because at the end of the day, it's a Blender UI. So this file deals with Blender. This file, of course, deals with Blender because I need Blender buttons, which do things. But you can see it's much smaller. This file is only 85 lines of code, and that's everything to do with attributes, nothing else.
Oh, okay. That looks less horrible than the 4,000 of lines.
Correct. And actually, the thousands of lines was structured like this as well. It's just that it's all in one file, so it looks scary. But now that it's all split up, it's easier for people to understand. The code is the same, it's just in different locations now. These files also do nothing about Blender. They're pure IFC, pure Python. So you'll notice there's no Blender dependencies. It's just Python. All this is pure IFC OpenShell. And same with this one. This one says edit attributes, right? If you want to edit attributes in IFC, this is how you do it. It's very simple because it is true in IFC OpenShell that is very simple to edit attributes.
The UI build the UI in Blender, and in the Blender UI, there's a buttons which link to the operator. So if you click the buttons or there's some data that need to be shown, they will be in the data Python and the attribute Python.
Correct. I'll show you what I mean. So if I go into UI, this one defines a panel with this title in this location. So if I go to this location, I will find a panel with that title. Then it runs the draw function. The draw function says, I should explain this. Every object in Blender, so if I take a look at the active object, that's the object I have selected. It stores a property called the IFC definition ID. This is what links it back to the IFC file, the step ID. So it says If it has no step ID, then it's not a BIM object. It's just a regular Blender object, like this. This is a regular Blender object. You can see it's 0. It's not linked back to IFC. But this is a BIM object because it has an IFC ID.
Okay.
Then it will say, so if there is no IFC ID, it doesn't need to do anything. It just stops. Then it checks if that ID is in its data, is not in the data. That means we haven't loaded the data for that object yet. And this is when it loads the object. So it will load all of the data, whatever it is, for that object. And in this case, because it's attributes, it will actually load all of this stuff like global ID and name and object type and tag. So now that it's loaded, there's 2 scenarios. Option 1 is, are you editing the attributes or not? So in this case, we're not editing the attributes yet. We haven't pressed the edit button. So it creates a new row, and operator is a button. And it's a button to enable the editing of attributes with the text that says edit with this icon. And that's this button here. And then below it, it's a loop for each attribute in the data. And you can see we've loaded the data now. So if the attribute is empty, or if it's a special type of attribute, like an entity, then we don't want to show it. Otherwise, we'll create a new row and we'll have one piece of text, which is the name, and one piece of text, which is the value.
Text
and that
is the left,
the right.
Yeah, the left is like lamb, the right one is the okay.
Yeah. So, and that's it. That's it so far. And so let's say I press this operator, this button here. You can see the operator is called BIM Enable Editing Attributes. So now if I go into operator and I search for enable editing attributes, this is the code that runs when I press the operator, press the button. So first it'll get the file, it'll get the object that I'm editing, it'll get the properties of that object, and then it'll say for all the attributes, for any attributes that it has stored against that object, delete them. And then it creates a whole bunch of new attributes. So it's a way of refreshing the attributes. It deletes all the previous ones in case it had any. And then for each attribute, create a new attribute property. Again, if it's a entity, then skip it because it's too complicated. That will be shown somewhere else in a different type of relationship.
All right.
And then we store some information, like whether it's null and depending on the type of value, it will store either a string or an integer or a float or an enum. And then finally, once it's created all those Blender properties, it will set is editing attributes to true. And if we look back at the UI, you remember this thing which says if is editing attributes, do all this stuff. So if I press that, you can see the UI changes because now this is set to true.
Yeah.
So it'll show a new row and there'll be 2 buttons. There'll be one which says save and then a disable button. So you can see save with an X next to it. Okay. And then it will show, and then for each attribute, it's the same stuff. If it's a string, show a string, integer, and blah, 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 blah. If it's a global ID, then we also want to show a special button that lets you generate the global ID. And if it's optional, then you can pick whether to make it null or not. So this is a new feature that you don't see in the old one. So you can see that this one is a null value.
Okay.
Or for example, this one is a slab which you can see it detects that this one I can pick as a landing slab. So this one intelligently picks the right data type for the attribute, which the old system didn't.
Oh, because you do the conditional checking.
Correct.
You check the attribute very first. Okay.
Better user experience as well. There's a whole bunch of new stuff as well, like the spatial containers. All this stuff has been really cleaned up. Like, for example, if I have property sets, now it's, all this is now standardized. So it has drop downs. I can say that's existing. I can set a new thermal transmittance. I can say this is load bearing. So it's a lot cleaner and a lot of new things.
I have a question about this. Like in this tab, object tab in Blender. So they are like meshed with the existing Blender properties, right?
Yeah.
Like if you scroll up, scroll up right there. So I see a lot of like long IFC
Blender
things.
property.
Like I think it's Blender. Were there any plans that like isolate them into another Windows? It's actually because at the beginning, like I look at the BlenderBIM add-on, I don't know where to find the IFC related or BIM related, content.
Yeah. I guess one thing is that all of the IFC panels have IFC in front of them, so that makes it a bit easier to find. It could be better. There is stuff tagged with BlenderBIM on the issue tracker.
Okay.
But these are very specific technical things. So it's not brainstorming. It's already, there are things which need to be fixed, and there's a way to fix them. Like the refactoring I'm doing, that is this one here. And this one is very complicated. And to the complicated ones, there are actually a lot of explanation, and there's like to-do lists as well. And some people, like you can see this person has contributed 3 of them.
Okay. So this is the actual place that people who want to contribute in like coding or solving problems. All right.
Correct. Yeah, but the everything that's here must be very specific. So it can't be it can't be too vague. There must be real solutions. It's not an open discussion. It's like a task with clear purpose and something like that.
Oh, got it. Then I got it. Okay.
Yeah. Like another really complicated one is improving construction drawings. And this is a very complicated one. And you can see there was a whole bunch of discussion. There's many examples. There even flow charts of trying to sort things out. And then to-do lists. So it's really quite detailed.